Yung dalawa nakahawak sa tigisang kamay.
2 soldiers were holding my arms and legs while I was being raped. When one was done, then they switched places. I couldn't do anything because my body wasn't so much pain.
Sa suntok at sampal na inaabot ko.
During World War II, Asia saw some of the worst atrocities committed by human beings in a military conflict, particularly those suffered by women in the territories conquered by Japan, who in many cases had a tragic fate. Hundreds of thousands were raped, both by soldiers and officers. Many were first tortured by mutilation with knives, and then finally killed. The few survivors were taken to brothels where their agony continued. Although the Imperials sought to eliminate any witness to these barbaric acts, many women were able to tell their tragic story. That is why today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you all about the rapes of the Japanese army during World War II. Although the sexual violence perpetrated by the Japanese had its climax in the context of this conflict, the reality is that its beginning can be traced back decades. At the end of the 19th century, the First Sino-Japanese War took place between the imperial side and the Qing dynasty of China. This war was mainly about the control of the Korean peninsula, which was at that time under Chinese rule. This region had great strategic importance for whoever held it, due to its geographical location. At the end of this conflict, after the Japanese victory, the Korean territory was no longer controlled by China and was officially recognized as independent. But in practice, the Japanese government controlled all the decisions of the new nation, and nothing was done without its approval. This semi-dependent relationship continued for decades until the Japan-Korea Annexation Treaty was signed in 1910. As its name indicates, the peninsula became part of the Empire of the Rising Sun. Any idea of freedom was thrown overboard, and the territory was officially converted into a colony. The treaty was accepted by both parties, but today there is no doubt that the Korean authorities were coerced and intimidated into accepting it. Any kind of protest or popular uprising was violently crushed by the imperial soldiers. In the decades that followed, Japanese citizens began to emigrate en masse to Korea. This was motivated by their government, which sought cultural assimilation between the two peoples. But relations between the two territories were never good. In 1937, the Japanese found themselves in another armed conflict with China, this time seeking the invasion and total conquest of its territory. To carry out their plans for domination, they needed to recruit a huge number of men, both to fight in battles and to work in industries and factories. Thus, as the conflict became part of the Second World War, Japan implemented forced labor policies on the Korean peninsula. Millions of native citizens of this area were forced to help in the imperial war effort, either on the local island or in the conquered territories. Many others joined the armed forces, either willingly or by force. But this did not only affect the male population. Young Korean women, usually between 12 and 17 years old, were also sought for jobs as seamstresses, nurses, or factory workers. But this was a lie that concealed the dark intentions of the Japanese.
Women with faces full of fear are lined up against the wall. A man presumed to be a Chinese officer talks to them. This short 18-second video is of 7 Korean women sexually enslaved by the Japanese soldiers in Yunnan province, southwest of China around the end of World War II.
These girls, after migrating to their new homes, were mostly used as sex slaves. Many of them, once they knew what their real job would be, did not have the means to return to their families. These comfort women, as they were known, were offered to Japanese soldiers when they were at their military bases with the intention of letting them off steam. This is what they did, sexually abusing these deceived girls. The number of people employed in these positions reached hundreds of thousands, and they were not only of Korean origin. Women from all the regions conquered by the Japanese, such as China, the Philippines, Indonesia, and even some from Australia and the Netherlands, suffered this cruel fate. Sometimes they did not even resort to the deception of offering a job. On many occasions, the soldiers broke into the homes of civilians and kidnapped the women. Although they preferred the younger ones, those who were older could also become their victims. Due to physical and psychological torture, thousands of these sex slaves decided to take their own lives. It is believed that around 300,000 women ended up being forced into military brothels. And as mentioned above, many of them were minors.
억지로 끌려가서 기사대기 몇 차례 맞고 그 말로 듣고 나이 아주 그 나이가 어리니까 피가 막 나잖아요. 담요에 피가 모두 묻고 이런 거. 그래 그거를 끌고 날이 새자 끌고 그 빨래터로 올라가니까 친구 둘이도 그래 당하고 앉아가 울고 있더라고. 이래가 우리가 어떻게 살겠나. 차라리 죽는 게 안 낫겠나.
Because of the high number of times they were raped, most of the women who survived this treatment ended up being infertile. This was also due to the venereal diseases they frequently suffered from. They could be forced to please more than 30 men a day, especially if a battle was approaching and superiors thought the soldiers needed high morale. The conditions where they lived were terrible. Water and food were often not enough, and they often did not have bathrooms. They were offered medical treatment only to eliminate sexually transmitted diseases or unwanted pregnancies, but not for the beatings they received from their abusers. If any of them refused to serve, they could be tortured or even threatened with repercussions towards their family.
Saka pagmamaltrato, kung nahirapan kang maririp na, siyempre, ilang hapon yan. Ano sa iyo, siyempre hirap ka rin. Dito matanggi ka, andyan ang paluin ka ng panghablit ng kabayo, andyan ang pasuin ka ng sigarilyo.
The brothels where they were enslaved were not only located in conquered cities, but many of them were mobile and followed the troops around the battlefields. So not only did they become victims of the Japanese, but hundreds of them were unwittingly killed in Allied attacks. When a Japanese position was overrun, they were often killed by the imperial soldiers themselves, who saw capture by the enemy as a less than honorable fate. They preferred death and never asked these women's opinion. Other times they were forced to take their own lives, along with the soldiers, either by means of poison, grenades, or jumping into the void. As we have already mentioned, the conflicts between China and Japan went back centuries, but it was in the 1930s that they became much more severe. In 1931, the Japanese invaded the northern region of China, known as Manchuria. As they had done in Korea, they established a puppet state there, called Manchukuo. Relations between the two nations remained strained until 6 years later. On July 7, 1937, Japan invaded Chinese territory en masse. Thus began the Second Sino-Japanese War, a conflict of extreme cruelty that for many reached the levels of brutality of the Nazis during the European occupation. In the first years of the war, the Imperials quickly devastated the Chinese defenses, whose men had vastly inferior training and equipment. a large number of cities and ports near Manchuria fell, further hampering the war effort of the defenders. By November, the important city of Shanghai had fallen. After a bloody battle with thousands dead on both sides, the attackers' next objective was Nanking, which at that time was the Chinese capital. The local leaders knew that there was no real chance of victory, but they still had to defend the city. Millions of civilians lived there, and it was known what happened to those who fell into Japanese hands. Stories of torture, rape, and mass murder by the invaders were not long in coming and followed them wherever they went. Based on these accounts, nearly half of the people of Nanking decided to evacuate, but many were unable or unwilling to do so. Already on the road between Shanghai and Nanking, the Japanese had committed terrible atrocities. Farmers were shot for fun, while planes flew low overhead, strafing houses for no particular reason. Whole villages were burned down, with their inhabitants inside. The few who were able to escape were killed. If they were women, it was customary to rape them before killing them. There are rumors that on this march towards the capital, soldiers cut open the bellies of pregnant women and removed the fetuses. They then shot or stabbed the mothers-to-be, or simply let them bleed to death.
看到我妈妈就睡在桌子外的地上一起爬的，我的小妹妹就死在院子里的，我姐姐呢一张都没有，也不晓得给她改，不知道就这样的。后来我们出来摇这个也不扶，摇那个也不扶，没得一个扶人了。
The raw account of the survivor is just one of the stories that marked the road to Nanking, but the massacre was yet to come. The key battle for territory began on December 10, 1937, and was over just 3 days later. Chinese troops simply could not compete with the imperial machine. Their defenses were swept away, and the Japanese conquered the capital of the Republic. Several of the defending soldiers panicked and fled, only to be shot by their superiors. Those who managed to escape abandoned their uniforms and blended in with the civilian population. They did not know that in doing so, they were signing their death sentence. In the days following the surrender of Nanking, the Japanese army began a brutal repression that would only calm down after months. Using the excuse of finding deserters infiltrated among the citizens, the Japanese searched house by house in search of weapons or military equipment. Even in the safety zone, as an area established by foreigners where armed men were not allowed to enter was known, soldiers stormed in on their mission. About 4,000 men were captured by the Japanese. Most of them were taken to the banks of the Yangtze River and shot. There is no doubt that many of them were simply defenseless civilians. In any case, if they had previously been Chinese combatants, the action would have been the same. A brutal war crime. But this cold-blooded event was only the beginning of something much worse, which later became known as the Rape of Nanking.
他把人家雇呢，一搞几十个姑娘，几十个姑娘排起队来，他选好的。我一想，我说我想个办法，你知道，我想个办法把头发剪来的，日本人还来找我麻烦。
The atrocities were not long in coming. The entire Japanese leadership thought that the war with China would last only a few months, based on how poorly equipped their enemy was. Although the attackers were ahead, they knew that they were far from achieving the total capitulation of their opponents. This, coupled with the consideration by many that the Chinese were an inferior race, led them to take a drastic decision. Nanking would be an example, showing the world what would happen to anyone who dared to challenge the authority of the Japanese Empire. The officers quickly transmitted the orders to their soldiers. they could be as brutal as they wanted. And so they did. Not a day went by without the Japanese men looting and destroying houses and businesses. Often, they set these buildings on fire. Soon, many of the homes in the capital fell victim to the fire. But this was the least of it. The Japanese pounced on the local population without mercy. Beatings occurred for any reason and often led to mutilation or even death. Summary executions for infractions or supposedly rebellious behavior were daily occurrences. Whole groups of people were taken to the outskirts of the city and machine-gunned or doused with gasoline and burned alive. Explosive mines were also used to kill many at a time, always finishing off anyone still breathing with their bayonets. The corpses were then dumped in the river, incinerated, or buried in mass graves, dug by the victims before they were killed. In just 6 weeks, the harshest period of the conquistadors' actions, deaths reached hundreds of thousands. The female population was also subjected to terrible abuses by the Japanese. It was common for them to invade family homes and rape the women and girls found there regardless of age. In the vast majority of cases, they were all killed after this inhuman act, along with their male members. Deaths could occur after long and agonizing tortures, where soldiers used bayonets to mutilate their private parts.
一搞技术后，他先漂亮的先到了，不漂亮就那机关枪哒哒哒哒哒一些死，就是我们都看到的，所以那个小他不要这样的。后来结果以后他把这大地娃一起打死了，没得了，他来搞我们了。
The Japanese raped as many as 1,000 women a day. Even those within the safety zone were in danger, as soldiers repeatedly trespassed. Sometimes they did not just do the abusing themselves, but forced the Chinese to do it. If the person refused, they were killed. Usually, they did it to members of the same family, such as fathers and daughters or siblings. As stated before, the invaders viewed these people as beings little more than animals. So many saw no moral conflict in these actions. The total number of victims during the rape of Nanking is estimated at between 20,000 and 30,000 women. Many of these women did not survive to tell the tale, and the vast majority of the perpetrators were never tried for their crimes. The massacre subsided in early 1938 when Japan established another of its puppet states in Nanking to administer the region. Still, this did not mean the end of the sufferings by the Chinese population. The conflict between these two nations continued until September 1945, when Japan signed an unconditional surrender and ended World War II. In the almost 8 years that the conflict between them and China lasted, atrocities against civilians continued to be committed, but this country, although it was the most frequent victim, was not the only one. In 1941, almost immediately after the attack on the American base at Pearl Harbor, the Japanese launched their massive invasion of Southeast Asian territories. Countries such as Burma, Malaysia, and the Philippines were attacked by entire regiments, while a large number of islands in the Pacific were surrounded by ships of the Imperial Navy. All these regions were colonies or allies of their enemies, so their civilian population was in great danger. We have already talked about how, during the years under Japanese control, the people living in these territories were victims of the cruelty of the soldiers. Women were taken by the thousands to brothels or raped and murdered on the spot. But one of these events stands out for the brutality of the acts carried out. By early 1945, the war in the Pacific had turned on its head, and now it was the empire of the rising sun that was on the defensive. The American Marines advanced slowly but surely in the occupied territories, liberating them at a tremendous cost. With each defeat, the Japanese began to realize that the chances of victory were zero, and that the best fate they could hope for was a glorious death in combat. Such was the case in Manila, capital of the Philippines. As the Americans penetrated their defenses, the Japanese took out their frustration and fear on the innocent civilian population. The locals had made clear their displeasure with the occupiers, and this was the excuse they used for their inhuman behavior. Any native found on the battlefield was branded an Allied collaborator and executed.
They did bad things to our women.
They're raping the civilian population.
They really did.
At saka yung
And in the final days, they were losing.
they were losing talaga.
And they were given the order.
Given an order. Kill every Filipino you see. See? Yan ang order.
That was the order, and that's what they did.
As with the Chinese and Korean female population, the Filipino women suffered a tragic fate. Women of all ages were taken to the Bayview Hotel, one of the most important in Manila, and their torture began there. The soldiers set up a jury, which was tasked with choosing the 25 most beautiful of all those gathered. These poor girls, who were between 12 and 14 years old, were repeatedly raped by the men, both infantrymen and high-ranking officers. A shift system was even organized so that everyone could commit these terrible crimes. As was also the case in China and elsewhere in Asia, the Japanese used to brutalize and murder their victims after sexually abusing them. There is one known case of 20 soldiers who raped a teenage girl, then cut off her breasts with their bayonets. When they got bored of her, they doused her with gasoline and set her on fire, along with 2 other women. This happened not only to Filipino natives, but also to foreigners living in the country. Even German women, who were supposed to be safe because of the alliance between the 2 countries, were raped, tortured, mutilated, and murdered. The crimes only stopped when the Japanese forces were defeated. Until the very last moment, these men did not miss an opportunity to harass and abuse the female population of the invaded countries. The number of women raped by them runs into the hundreds of thousands, or even millions. Only a few were tried after the war for these acts, and it was almost always the officers who gave the orders. Millions of the perpetrators continued to live in peace, never facing the consequences of their actions. We have reached the end of this video, and we want to ask you, what other Japanese war crimes do you know? Don't forget to leave your answer in the comments box and subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.